Quote from Mother Teresa of Calcutta, "What the poor need most is not pity, but love. They need to feel respect for their human dignity, which is neither less nor different from the dignity of any other human being." Welcome to the 5th episode of Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. My name is David Stevenson. The history of the IMB and the history of Bolivia are intertwined, and I believe you can't fully appreciate the life stories of the IMB saints and martyrs without knowing a little about the history of Bolivia. However, I fully understand that there are many folks who are not all that interested in the history of Bolivia. The good news is that this episode and the next episode are the last of the historical context or the Bolivian Reality episodes. Our 6th podcast broadcast will be about Simon Bolivar, and the 7th will begin telling the powerful life stories of individual Methodists in Bolivia, so hang with me. Our last 2 podcasts describe the incredible silver thread that runs through the Guayu of Bolivia, which increased the standard of living of the entire world. I also spoke of the enslavement and death of over 8 million men as they mined the mountain that eats men. This week, we will examine what happened as more and more Spaniards migrated to Bolivia looking for wealth and power and the development of the Hacienda, Peon agricultural system. Because the Spaniards were the first Europeans to arrive in South America, according to European law, they believed that they had a right to claim all the land in the name of the Spanish crown. The king granted deeds to Spanish conquistadors based on the influence their families had in Spain. The more influential families received the more productive mines. The less influential families received the lesser mines. However, by 1575, almost all the good mining areas had been deeded to some Spanish nobleman's son. Those Spaniards who came to Bolivia, who did not get ownership of a mine, found a more traditional way to wealth and power: land. Beginning around 1575, the King of Spain began to deed large tracts of land to those families who found favor in the king's court and who served him. This was no egalitarian homestead act. The King of Spain needed money to pay for the administration of a standing army in Bolivia, to support the Spanish crown and the huge Spanish fleet. So he announced that he would now tax the vast farmlands of Bolivia. Of course, the indigenous people who lived on the land didn't have the money to purchase or pay the taxes on the land that their family and their community had lived on and cultivated for hundreds of years. However, the conquistadors, those second sons of the elite of Spain, They could afford to pay the taxes. Consequently, vast tracts of thousands of hectares were given to individual families. These families of the nobility were not expected to farm these land themselves. They were to simply take the produce from those serfdom farmers who were actually farming the land. The property lines drawn by the King of Spain in Madrid simply ignored the existence of the people and the villages who had been farming the land for thousands of years. Those who found their homes and farms suddenly owned by a patron became controlled by the patron. They were, in fact, little fiefdoms ruled by these families, these patrons, with little or no outside influence. The first thing that most patrons did was move the indigenous homes from the middle of the productive area of the farm to the less productive areas on the edges. They required each family to work a portion of the patron's land, which was usually divided up into the number of families that lived on the hacienda. Each patron treated their peones or peons however they chose. I'm sure there were some patrons who treated their peons kindly and fairly. However, clearly, the majority treated them as not much more than slaves. They would be assigned to raise sheep or plant potatoes or other crops and meet quotas which were set by the patron. And after working all day on the patron's crops and on his flocks, they were to go out and work on their tiny plots that the patrons had provided for the peons to raise food to feed their own family. Not only did they have to work on the patron's crops for free, they also had to pay a percentage of the crops from their personal plots to the patron to pay for the use of the land which the patron so generously gave them. If the peasants fell short on the established amount they were to deliver to the patron, they had to make up the difference from their own private plot. When they couldn't do that, the servant would be whipped or even killed. Remember, this is the land that these indigenous families have lived on for millennia, and now they have to pay the patron to live and farm the least productive portions of that land. And the ultimate humiliation and abuse was called the mitani. The mitani was a law that required married women to serve as professional servants in the homes of the patron. They were maids, personal servants, and cooks, etc. It also led to an enormous amount of sexual abuse and rape of these indigenous women by the patrons. There was absolutely no pay to the peon from the patron for their work. The patron had absolute power over the hacienda. Peons could be expelled from the land without any legal recourse or be severely punished for any reason he chose. The patrons felt justified because, after all, they were heirs of the Spanish ancestry. As descendants of the Conquistadors, they had conquered this land and they deserved to rule it however they chose. At that time, social Darwinism was spreading across the world. This is a theory that certain races would dominate other certain races because they were superior, and that was the only way that the human race could become stronger and better. Well, the Criollo of Bolivia embraced this theory, which justified their domination and subjugation of the indigenous people by those of European descent. As recently as 1960, G. René Moreno, a Criollo in Bolivia, affirmed that, quote, "The Indian and the mestizo do not strictly serve anything in the evolution of modern societies toward progress. In the struggle for existence, they must sooner or later disappear under the domination of pure or purified white races." In 1971, Baptista Saavedra, another Criollo patron, said, "If a lower race is placed next to a superior race, one has to disappear. As LeBron says, we must exploit the Aymara and Quechua Indians to our advantage, or we must eliminate them, because they constitute an obstacle and delay in our progress. Let us do so frankly and vigorously," end quote. These guys are openly and without fear proclaiming that the indigenous races should either be slaves or face genocide and disappear as a race. The Spanish monarchy also gave land and the peons that lived on the land over to the Catholic priests to provide for the church. In fact, the largest landowner in Bolivia and the greatest patrons were the Jesuit priests. Apparently, working for a priest was no better than working for a patron. Some of the most despicable acts were done by Catholic priests that served in the countryside. The church made reading the Bible illegal in Bolivia, even for the educated Criollo. The church wanted sole control of the interpretation of the Bible, what passages would be shared with the Bolivian people, and what passages would never be spoken. The worst practice was the education of engaged indigenous women. It was a common practice that once a young indigenous woman became engaged, she would spend a week in the priest's rectory to be taught how to be a good wife. It is well known that this frequently and perhaps primarily involved the priest having sex with the young engaged girl. To this day, Bolivia has many indigenous people who have always lived in indigenous communities, but who are clearly a mixture of indigenous and European blood, a mestizo, being raised by their indigenous mother. In 1989, one Aymara Methodist told me that it happened to his mother. He said, quote, "It's hard to forget. I don't have hatred of the Catholics anymore, but what worries me is they might still be doing it. They have so much power they can do anything. But the Bible says to forgive your enemy. The Bible preaches peace, but we find it hard to forget," unquote. An unholy alliance was formed between the patrons and the church. The church supported and justified the Hacienda patron-peon system. It preached that God had ordained that system, that the peons should be obedient servants and look for salvation in the next life. This was probably enhanced by the fact that almost all the priests came from Italy or Spain, and they had the same racial biases as the patrons. The patrons in return became devout Catholics in the most conservative and fanatical expression of Catholicism. The patrons who controlled the government made Catholicism the state religion, outlawing all Protestant denominations and all other religions. The power of the patron and the power of the Catholic Church were completely entwined. Each was dependent upon the other. An attack on any part of this power structure was seen as an attack upon the whole. Remember, at this time, the indigenous people represented somewhere between 80 to 90% of the population. Any challenge to the Hacienda system was a challenge against the church, and any introduction of Protestantism would lead to an attack on the Hacienda system. This explains the violent attacks upon Methodists for nearly 100 years, whose story I will be telling in the upcoming podcast. The existence of a Methodist church in Bolivia not only threatened the absolute religious control of the Roman Catholic Church, it was a challenge to the status quo, and therefore would lead to a challenge to the patron system. The Methodists had to be stopped. The patrons used several different strategies to control their peons. The preaching of the Catholic Church was critical. The patrons also hired thugs to beat up and force indigenous to submit. But worst of all, they used the lack of education, hunger, and unhealthy working conditions without access to medical care to control the peons. When you're sick and malnourished, you don't care about other politics. You only care about getting something to eat today. Just one example of this is that indigenous peons were taught by the patrons that if you gave milk, cheese, or eggs to children under the age of 4, your children would have poor eyesight and would be physically unable to work or have any kind of a quality of life. Think about that. Most of today's Aymara believe that the patron had two purposes for teaching this horrendous lie. First, cheese and eggs were very valuable commodities, and the patrons wanted all those commodities to come to the patron to feed his children and his family, and also to sell the excess. Second, many Aymara believe it was to keep the children of the indigenous malnourished and to delay or damage the brain development of the indigenous people. Now, not all the indigenous people lived on haciendas. Those indigenous communities that lived in remote areas or less productive land or in the slums surrounding the cities were allowed to keep the ownership of the land. However, they were victims of military, civil, and ecclesiastical authorities, as well as the state tax requirements. They were required to provide personal services to the government and or the church establishment of each town. The system was constantly trying to strip them from their small agricultural plots. For instance, Elizardo Perez of Warisata tells a story about an illiterate indigenous person who needed the services of a lawyer. The lawyer would say something like, quote, "We will solve this case in your favor if we use this book," pointing to a large, not a law book, but a large dictionary. "And this will cost you 400 Bs. Or I can use this other book," and he pointed to a smaller book. "And finally, if we use this other," pointing to a pamphlet, "it will cost you only 100 Bs, but we will probably lose the case. Which book do you want me to use?" Sometimes local priests would take advantage of the indigenous' naivete in regard to faith. The quality of service of the church would depend on the amount of money the peasants paid when they needed the services of the priest. The indigenous wanted a mass to be celebrated for the soul of the deceased. The validity of the celebration had to do with the amount of payment that was made. For 50 Bolivianos, the service would take the soul to heaven. For 20 Bolivianos, the souls would barely reach purgatory. And if you didn't pay anything, your loved one went to hell. All of this was justifiable to the Criollo because, well, they were Indians. This is how Indians should be treated. This kind of treatment was still going on when I first went to Bolivia in 1987. In 1988, I took my second team to Bolivia and met Dr. Herman Crespo, and he told me and the team about a young man he had recently met as a result of Herman serving on the Human Rights Assembly of Bolivia. This man wanted to attend the university. He was denied entrance into the school because he was Aymara. The young man bleached his hair blonde and applied again. The school said, "This is terrible. The white people not only have the hair, but they also have blue eyes," which is weird since I've seen very few, if any, Criollo with blue eyes. The young man put some blue paper on his eyes, which stained his eyes blue and also caused a great infection, but still he was denied. He learned English because he thought, "I must learn English to be like the others." He soon could speak English quite well, and he was able to get into a trade school where he learned about business and economics. His first job was to work for the Catholic Church in the main offices in La Paz, but only as a mere elevator operator. One day the bishop got on the elevator and told the young man to take him to the 3rd floor. The young man closed the elevator door, took it halfway up, and turned off the elevator and said, "Okay, now we are going to talk." The bishop was afraid. "You are always talking about love, and look at my salary. I speak English. I've studied economics. I can drive. You never let me work here in any capacity except to run the elevator. It's only because I'm an Aymara." The bishop said he would see what he could do. The young man let the bishop out of the elevator, and the bishop fired him the next day. Sometime later, the young man was working in the print shop of a newspaper. Someone from the print shop came to him and asked him if he would like to make some extra money. Sure. The man gave him a part and said, "We need to sell this part of the machinery. Go to another newspaper and see if you can sell it." So he went to another paper and asked them if he would like to buy this part. They said, "Yes, of course." They immediately called the first newspaper and said somebody was trying to sell a part from their printing machine. It had been stolen by a Criollo who gave it to the young man to sell. But it was the young Aymara who was arrested. From jail, he called the Human Rights Assembly, and Herman went to see him in jail. The young man told Herman his whole story and how he learned English, and he finished an economics degree, and he could drive, but no one wants to give him a job because he's Aymara. He said, "My name is Franz Noelapan." Herman said, "That's not an Aymara name. What does this name mean? Why did you take that name?" "Well, it's Napoleon spelled backwards." And he was crazy too. The Human Rights Assembly got him out of jail. In 1988, he had a job working at the toll booth for the Autopista, the highway that goes between La Paz and the airport. So how does he spend his money in 1988? He goes to the public hospital each month and he chooses a girl who has a baby who is sick. And he says to her, "I want to help you with your expenses for this month. I don't want any Aymara baby to suffer like me." This is just one minor story of the oppression of the indigenous people. There are millions of other stories. Another critical tool to keep the power of the Criollo was to continue to destroy the indigenous people's sense of self-worth and self-esteem. It is hard for me to explain how deep and ingrained and powerful is this lack of self-esteem. The indigenous people were told over and over again for 400 years that they were inferior, ugly, uneducable, and stupid. Most couldn't speak the language of the country, Spanish. Most indigenous seemed to accept this lie, or at least realize it was futile to try to change things. And look around them. The white people had all the money and all the power. And if you challenged the system, you would at best be beaten and expelled from your home with no place to go, or at worst, you would be killed. It was illegal for the indigenous people to even step foot in certain parts of the major cities without a permit from a Criollo. What followed was similar to what happened to Afro-Americans during the Jim Crow era of the United States. If a person raised in an indigenous home had light enough skin, they would straighten their hair with harsh chemicals, change their name to a Hispanic name or even an English name, and go and try to pass as a mestizo. If this was successful, they would often leave and never see their parents again, fearful that someone might catch them and discover they were really indigenous. In 2008, I had one of the most bizarre experiences of all my time in Bolivia. I received a call from a very highly ranked member of the new Bolivian government, which was run by a new indigenous president. This man was a Methodist, and he asked me to come and meet him in his office. I didn't know him. I thought it was about some of the work I was doing, perhaps with Engineers in Action. When I got there, I soon realized it was not about my work. He was a deeply troubled young man, and he needed counseling. We spent over 2 hours together speaking through an interpreter. He had chosen me because he had heard of my work with Engineers in Action and with the Methodist Church. He was told that I was someone who could be trusted. He didn't want to talk to any indigenous pastor, and he knew that I was one who understood the Bolivian reality. I, of course, will not share his name or what ministry he worked in. The young man was indigenous and had grown up in a good-sized indigenous town. He was ambitious, intelligent. He wanted a better life for himself. He identified himself as a mestizo. He changed his name from an Aymara name to a Spanish name. He straightened his hair and moved to La Paz. He got an education, a good job, even married a beautiful Hispanic young woman. When Evo Morales was running for president, the man suddenly changed his attitude. He joined the campaign and identified himself once again as Aymara, and he ended up working inside the government. This was during the time when the government was campaigning for a new constitution which would eliminate all apartheid-type laws and end Catholicism as a state religion. The government asked him to go to his hometown to speak and campaign for the new constitution. When he was introduced to the crowd using his Hispanic name, they began to heckle and whistle. "We know you. You are," and they used his Aymara name. "You abandoned us. You abandoned your community and your family." And he was jeered right off the stage, and he immediately retreated to La Paz. He told me, I just wanted a better life for me. But when he was faced with all that he had given up, he was devastated. He talked about the IMB and possibly becoming a Methodist pastor. But he also knew that if he did that, his wife and his children would leave him. I told him that becoming a pastor is not something you run to when things aren't working out in your life. It's a calling from God. And I gave him a few names of IEMB pastors who I knew could help him make that decision and help him work through his identity crisis as well as keep his secret. I know he went and visited some of those pastors, and I'm not sure what he did from that point on. You see, one of the most intentional tools used by the patrones to control the indigenous people and destroy their self-esteem was to withhold education. It was illegal to teach the Aymaras how to read and write in the national language of Spanish until the Agrarian Revolution of 1952. Think about that. For 400 years, it was illegal for the indigenous people to learn how to read and write in their own national language. The patrones knew that it was essential to keep the peons from learning about the outside world. The patrones and the employers would always say that the indigenous were uneducable because they were inferior beings. Pastor Gustavo Loza tells a story about a person in the 1990s who was teaching the indigenous in the cities how to read and write Spanish, and someone told him, quote, "It's so sad to see your generous but sterile effort. Do you not realize that the Indian cannot be educated? Look at that." He pointed to 2 donkeys that were crossing the road. "Would you raise a school to educate those donkeys? The Indians are animals and therefore cannot be educated. You are wasting your time." Why was there so much humiliation, denigration, and hate? The oligarchy was afraid of the indigenous populations, who, if they began to recover their being, their dignity, and learn to read, it would be a dangerous first step toward the end of the Hispanic domination of Bolivia. Therefore, it was determined to legally prohibit the indigenous from learning to read. And it became law that whoever dared to teach them would receive extreme punishment, including the cutting off of their hands. Pastor Gustavo Loza in 1970 wrote a paper entitled "The Mission of the Methodist Church is Part of the Historic Fabric in Bolivia." In his paper, he states that, quote, "Education was an expression of freedom for the servants who always happened to be indigenous people, lost in their own lands. They lost their mentality and spirit and became slaves. Reading and writing meant subversion in those times for the circles of power. It was education that became the tool to recover speech and action so they could live, think, and act as full human beings. Education meant something mystical, something sacred, and was a force of liberation for the indigenous. It would help them to see themselves as real persons who would vindicate the land, their identity, and education." End quote. He is right. It was education that brought an end to the Hacienda system in 1952, and it would be education and the courageous leadership of indigenous leaders, willing to suffer and even die if needed, to bring an end to the near-apartheid system of oppression. The Methodists of Bolivia were often on the front line. We have now added to our guayo, our blanket, the dark and ugly thread of the Hacienda era, a thread weighed down by racism and elitism. And over these 5 episodes, We've laid out the historical background and context in which the Methodists and other Protestant missionaries found themselves as they entered Bolivia. And they would find themselves caught between two worlds, two views, two radically different approaches to their work. Our next broadcast will be on Sunday, November 1st. It will be a very, very short episode about Bolivian independence from Spain and an amazing man named Simón Bolívar, the liberator of a continent. On November 15th, we will begin to hear the stories and the struggles of the United States missionaries that came to Bolivia, and we will look honestly at both the good and the bad of their work. This week on the website at www.weavingtheblanket.com on the home page, if you click on the Dig Deeper button, you will find the following. An edited version of the cassette tape recording made in 1988 of Dr. Crespo telling us the story of Hans Noelapon. Second is the paper, The Mission of the Methodist Church is Part of the Historical Fabric of Bolivia, Weaving the Big Multicolor Aguayo from the Aymara People, written by Pastor Gustavo Loza in 1970. As you can tell, it's from him that I got the idea of using the aguayo as the symbol of this podcast, with his permission, of course, and much of the information for this particular podcast. Special thanks go out to Gustavo. And third, there will be links where you can go and learn more about the forced labor system of the Haciendas for those who wish to dig deeper. I especially want to thank, again, Pastor Gustavo Loza for sharing his research and his writing about this subject and for his reviews and edits. Join with me in 2 weeks to meet Simón Bolívar, the liberator of a continent.